The city appears first as a system, not a place. Concrete corridors, flickering light, sirens dissolving into routine noise. A territory governed less by law than by repetition. Rules exist, but they circulate like rumors rather than commands. Justice is present only as language, spoken often, enforced selectively, trusted rarely. What holds the city together is not belief in fairness, but fatigue. People learn where not to look. Institutions learn what not to pursue. Order survives by lowering its gaze. Violence does not arrive as an interruption. It is already folded into the architecture. It lives in alleys and courtrooms alike. It wears different faces, some sanctioned, some condemned. The city teaches early that harm is not the exception. It is the cost of continuity. Those who suffer learn to endure. Those who benefit learn to justify. Between them stands a fragile moral fiction, that mercy tempers justice, that restraint signals strength, that the system bends toward balance over time. This belief is not naive. It is necessary. Without it, the structure collapses under its own contradictions. Mercy becomes the soft tissue cushioning a rigid frame. It allows imperfection to persist without open revolt. It asks victims to wait. It asks executioners to hesitate. It promises that delay is wisdom. The city runs on this promise, even as it quietly breaks it every day. Within this environment, figures emerge not as individuals, but as responses. Some respond by adapting, some by escaping, some by exploiting the gap between what is said and what is done, and some by refusing the gap altogether. These are not heroes in the classical sense. They are corrections, pressure points where the system tightens until something gives. The Punisher is not introduced as a man. He appears as an absence, the absence of patience, the absence of forgiveness, the absence of faith in gradual repair. Where others negotiate with the system, he steps outside its language. He does not argue for justice. He assumes its failure as a starting condition. His presence signals not rebellion, but replacement. What makes him unsettling is not his violence. Violence is already normalized. What disturbs is his clarity. He does not hesitate. He does not plead. He does not perform moral struggle for public consumption. His actions feel less like choice and more like consequence, as if a law ignored too long has finally begun to enforce itself. In the cultural imagination, justice is usually paired with mercy as proof of maturity. To forgive is framed as elevation. To restrain power is framed as civilization. The Punisher rejects this pairing entirely. He treats mercy not as virtue, but as a structural weakness. In his logic, mercy does not humanize justice. It compromises it. It allows harm to repeat under the guise of compassion. This rejection is not emotional. It is architectural. Mercy in his world is not a feeling. It is a delay mechanism, a way for institutions to appear moral while remaining ineffective. Each spared life becomes another future victim. Each reduced sentence becomes another funeral waiting its turn. The cost of mercy is never paid by those who grant it. The city responds to him with confusion before condemnation. At first, he feels like an anomaly, an outlier, a brutal symptom of deeper illness. But as his presence persists, the narrative shifts. He becomes a mirror. Law enforcement sees in him the outcome of their compromises. Criminals see the end of negotiation. Civilians see a question they are afraid to ask directly. What if mercy is not the highest expression of justice? What if it is the reason justice never arrives? This question cannot be resolved comfortably. It destabilizes the moral center the city depends on. If mercy is removed, justice becomes absolute. And absolute justice does not negotiate. It does not contextualize. It does not rehabilitate. It ends threats rather than managing them. It redraws the territory entirely. The Punisher operates like a gravitational force. He pulls moral language toward extremes. Gray zones collapse under his presence. Neutrality becomes complicity. Silence becomes consent. The system is forced to define itself against him, and in doing so reveals how much of its authority rests on postponement rather than resolution. Importantly, he does not seek recognition. He does not attempt to replace the state symbolically. He does not claim a crown. His power comes from refusal. Refusal to forgive. Refusal to stop. Refusal to pretend that moral balance can be achieved without destruction. He occupies the space beyond reform, where outcomes matter more than intentions. This is why attempts to frame him as a villain feel incomplete. Villains desire. They want control, admiration, domination. He wants nothing. His actions are not expressions of will, but of verdict. The difference is subtle and profound. Desire can be negotiated with. Verdict cannot. As the city watches, unease spreads. Not because he might be wrong, but because he might be right. The idea that mercy requires its own victims is difficult to face. It suggests that the moral high ground is built on deferred suffering. That restraint is a luxury paid for by those without protection. The Punisher does not argue this point. He demonstrates it. Each action compresses the moral field further. Each body marks a line crossed permanently. There is no return to innocence once the question is fully articulated. Can justice survive without mercy? Or does justice only become real when mercy ends? The opening tension is not whether he will be stopped. It is whether the city can survive the clarity he introduces. A clarity that exposes the cost of compromise. A clarity that leaves no space to hide. The conflict is already in motion. It has been for years. He is not the beginning. He is the reckoning. Frank Castle does not emerge from chaos. He emerges from order that failed quietly. Before the rupture that defines him, his world is structured, disciplined, and legible. Military hierarchy, chain of command, rules of engagement. Violence exists, but it is contained within a framework that assigns meaning to destruction. There are objectives. There are boundaries. There is a shared fiction that force, when correctly applied, restores balance rather than erodes it. Castle learns early that killing is not inherently corrupting when it serves a structure that claims legitimacy. This early conditioning matters. It forms the psychological grammar through which he later interprets loss. Castle is not shaped by impulsive brutality, but by regulated force. He understands violence as labor, not expression. It is something done because it must be done, not because it feels good or proves dominance. This distinction separates him from the criminals he will later hunt. They use violence to assert selfhood. He uses it to erase threats. When his family is killed, the event does not simply traumatize him. It invalidates the structure that once gave violence its limits. The system that promised protection fails without explanation or consequence. The killers remain alive. The institutions remain intact. The narrative of justice continues as if nothing foundational has collapsed. This is the true fracture, not grief alone, but the realization that moral order is performative. What dies with his family is not hope, but patience. The idea that time corrects injustice becomes unbearable. Castle does not spiral into confusion or denial. He arrives at clarity with unsettling speed. If the system cannot close the loop between crime and consequence, then consequence must be delivered elsewhere. Not symbolically, not procedurally, physically. This is where the Punisher diverges from other vigilante figures. He does not seek to supplement the law. He seeks to replace its missing function. He does not romanticize justice. He operationalizes it. In his internal logic, guilt is not something to be proven endlessly. It is something to be neutralized. The moral question is not whether someone deserves death, but whether allowing them to live enables further harm. Opposing him are figures who still believe in the elasticity of morality. Law enforcement officers, lawyers, judges, masked heroes. They operate within gradients. Circumstance matters. Intent matters. Rehabilitation matters. Mercy is framed as a civilizing force. To restrain violence is to rise above it. This belief sustains their identities. Without it, their authority becomes indistinguishable from control. These figures are not corrupt by default. They are invested. Their sense of self depends on the idea that restraint equals virtue. The badge, the mask, the robe. Each symbol signals alignment with a higher moral order. To abandon mercy would be to admit that the system they serve cannot deliver justice without becoming something darker. They fear this admission more than failure itself. Castle does not share this fear. He has already crossed the threshold where identity dissolves into function. He does not need to be seen as good. He needs outcomes to stop repeating. In this sense, his psychology is stripped of self-preservation in the conventional sense. He does not protect an image. He protects a boundary. The boundary is simple. Those who cause irreparable harm lose the right to continue acting. This principle is inflexible by design. Flexibility, in Castle's worldview, is the mechanism through which predators survive. Negotiation extends their lifespan. Mercy multiplies their reach. Complexity becomes camouflage. This brings him into inevitable collision with figures like Daredevil, Captain America, or any agent who believes that justice must remain morally legible to remain valid. For them, killing without trial collapses the distinction between protector and tyrant. For Castle, this distinction is already meaningless if the protector fails repeatedly. Legibility is irrelevant if it produces bodies. The psychological tension between these positions is not rooted in cruelty versus compassion. It is rooted in time. Castle operates in the present tense. Threats exist now. Victims bleed now. Consequences must arrive now. His opponents operate in deferred time. Justice unfolds. Systems adjust. Healing takes patience. This temporal mismatch cannot be reconciled. The more Castle acts, the more he destabilizes the moral economy around him. He exposes an uncomfortable truth, that mercy often functions as moral insulation. Those who grant it rarely absorb its cost. The cost is displaced onto future victims, anonymous and unseen. Castle refuses to accept this displacement. He internalizes the cost by becoming the one who acts. Criminals perceive him differently than they perceive heroes. Heroes threaten capture. Castle threatens erasure. There is no performance in his presence. No speech. No final chance. This alters behavior at a structural level. Fear becomes specific. It attaches to actions rather than identity. The city's underworld reorganizes around avoidance rather than negotiation. Law enforcement, meanwhile, is forced into an impossible position. Castle accomplishes what they cannot publicly condone. Crime drops where he operates. Certain threats disappear permanently. Yet to acknowledge his effectiveness would be to undermine their own legitimacy. They oscillate between condemnation and quiet relief. This ambivalence corrodes their authority from within. Culturally, Castle emerges at moments of collective frustration, periods when faith in institutions erodes, when narratives of reform feel hollow. He is less a character than a pressure valve, a fantasy of finality in a world addicted to endless process. His popularity spikes not because audiences crave violence, but because they crave closure. Psychologically, he embodies the shadow of the justice system itself. Everything it refuses to do, everything it delays, everything it disguises in language. He carries the aggression that the system disavows while benefiting from its containment. In doing so, he reveals the dependency beneath the condemnation. The Punisher does not argue that he is right. He does not seek moral validation. His certainty is operational, not ideological. This makes him difficult to dismantle rhetorically. You cannot shame someone who has already abandoned the need for innocence. You cannot threaten someone who does not imagine a future worth protecting. This absence of future orientation is often misread as nihilism. It is not. Castle believes deeply in consequence. He simply believes that some consequences must be immediate and irreversible to have meaning. Mercy, in his framework, erodes consequence by introducing contingency where clarity is required. As these forces align, the conflict becomes inevitable. Not a clash of personalities, but a clash of moral architectures. One built on restraint, delay, and symbolic authority. The other built on finality, action, and material outcomes. Once these structures collide, compromise becomes impossible. The field is set. The system has revealed its limits. The response has taken form. What follows is not escalation for its own sake, but the logical expansion of a principle that refuses to bend. The conflict takes shape not through spectacle, but through accumulation. There is no single moment where the Punisher announces himself as an ideology. He operates instead like pressure building beneath a surface already fractured. Each act follows another with quiet consistency. Targets are chosen with an almost bureaucratic precision. Patterns emerge before narratives do. The city begins to register absence before it registers fear. At first, the violence is interpreted as escalation within the criminal ecosystem itself. A gang war, a power struggle, an internal correction. This misreading is important. It reveals how accustomed the city has become to violence that circulates without resolution. Death alone does not signify disruption. Only death that alters structure does. And slowly, Castle's actions begin to do exactly that. Drug routes collapse without being claimed. Syndicates lose leadership without succession. Middlemen vanish, leaving chains of dependency broken and unrepaired. The usual rhythms fail. Bribes no longer reach their recipients. Informants have no one left to inform on. The criminal world, which relies on predictability as much as profit, begins to lose coherence. This is the first real signal that something fundamentally different is at work. Castle does not seek dominance within the system. He is not building an empire. He leaves no replacements. His violence does not redistribute power. It removes it. The territory does not change hands. It empties. From a psychological perspective, this is the critical shift. Violence ceases to be expressive and becomes subtractive. It no longer communicates status or ambition. It communicates termination. This alters how fear functions. Fear is no longer tied to rival factions or visible enemies. It becomes ambient, directionless, a weight rather than a warning. Law enforcement notices next, not because Castle announces himself, but because familiar cases stop looping. Certain names no longer reappear in reports. Certain neighborhoods grow quieter without explanation. Clearance rates do not rise. Arrests do not increase. Yet harm declines in pockets that defy statistical expectation. This produces cognitive dissonance. The system is designed to measure progress through procedure. Arrests, prosecutions, convictions. Castle's work bypasses all of these metrics. There is no paperwork trail that leads to success. only absence, only the sudden irrelevance of ongoing investigations. The first official responses frame him as a destabilizing threat, a rogue element, a terrorist. This framing is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. What truly threatens the system is not Castle's brutality, but his efficiency. He exposes how much of law enforcement energy is spent managing continuity, rather than producing closure. Heroes who operate near the margins of legality feel the tension earlier and more acutely. Figures like Daredevil sense that Castle is not simply breaking rules, but rendering them obsolete. The familiar moral debate arises quickly. Killing removes the possibility of redemption. It erases due process. It transforms justice into execution. Castle does not respond to these accusations directly. His actions function as replies. Each time a spared criminal returns to harm, his logic sharpens. Each time mercy fails to interrupt the cycle, restraint begins to look less like virtue and more like avoidance. The psychological structure here is unforgiving. Castle's worldview is reinforced not by belief, but by feedback. The environment confirms his assumptions. Violence curtailed permanently produces fewer victims than violence moderated temporarily. The data accumulates, even if it cannot be publicly acknowledged. This feedback loop creates inevitability. Once the principle proves effective, it demands expansion. Castle's scope widens not out of ambition, but out of consistency. If some forms of irreparable harm justify final response, then others must be examined under the same logic. The boundary shifts outward. This expansion alarms those who still believe in gradation. Not because Castle is wrong in specific cases, but because his method cannot be selectively contained. Absolute justice does not negotiate its perimeter. Once mercy is removed, the criteria for elimination become the central ethical battleground. Castle appears indifferent to this concern. From his perspective, the battleground already exists. It has simply been concealed behind process. He treats ethical discomfort as collateral, a necessary disturbance that surfaces truth. The city reacts unevenly. Some communities experience tangible relief. The absence of repeat offenders feels like a miracle. Others recoil at the implication. If justice can be this final, who decides where it stops? The fear shifts from criminals to citizens. Not because Castle targets innocence, but because his logic admits no appeal. This is the moment where polarization begins to solidify. Support and condemnation form around incompatible intuitions. Safety versus legitimacy. Outcome versus principle. Finality versus restraint. The conversation ceases to be about Castle as a person and becomes about justice as a concept. Media amplification accelerates this process. Castle's symbol spreads faster than his actions. The skull becomes a shorthand for frustration, rage, and unspoken desire for closure. It detaches from Castle himself and enters circulation as a cultural signal. Law enforcement resents this appropriation. Criminals fear it. Civilians project onto it. Symbols simplify. Nuance collapses. Castle's internal logic is flattened into slogans he never speaks. This distortion does not weaken his impact. It strengthens it. The symbol does what institutions cannot. It communicates consequence without explanation. Within the system, resistance hardens. Task forces are formed. Lines are drawn. The state cannot allow a figure like Castle to operate unchecked without conceding its monopoly on justice. This resistance is less about stopping him and more about preserving symbolic authority. Castle anticipates this shift. He does not attempt to hide indefinitely. He understands that visibility is part of the function. Pressure must be felt to be effective. His movements become more deliberate, more declarative, not as spectacle, but as signal. This escalation is not emotional. It is structural. The more the system tightens around him, the more it reveals its dependence on the very mercy he rejects. Plea deals, reduced sentences, protective custody. Mechanisms designed to preserve order through compromise. Castle interprets these mechanisms as vulnerabilities. Each compromise is another delay. Each delay is another body waiting to fall. His response becomes more comprehensive. He targets infrastructure, not just individuals. Supply chains, financial arteries, communication hubs. This marks the end of ambiguity. Castle is no longer perceived as a violent anomaly. He is recognized as an opposing architecture, one that operates parallel to the state while undermining its foundational assumptions. The conflict has fully entered motion. What began as correction has become confrontation, not between individuals, but between moral systems that cannot coexist without erasing each other. The next movement will not ask whether Castle is justified. It will ask whether the idea of mercy can survive exposure to its own cost. As the confrontation deepens, the conflict sheds any remaining ambiguity. What was once perceived as disruption now functions as counterstructure. Castle's actions no longer sit at the edges of the system. They press directly against its center. Institutions are forced to respond not just tactically, but symbolically. Each move against him becomes a statement about what justice is allowed to be. The state escalates through familiar mechanisms. Warrants, manhunts, interagency cooperation. Language tightens. Castle is framed as an extremist, a destabilizer, a singular threat whose elimination will restore balance. This narrative is necessary. Without it, the system would have to confront the possibility that he is not an exception, but a consequence. That he emerges precisely where procedural justice exhausts its credibility. Castle understands this dynamic instinctively. He does not avoid pursuit because pursuit validates his role. The more resources devoted to stopping him, the more visible the system's priorities become. Entire task forces mobilize to protect figures who, under different circumstances, would be considered expendable. The imbalance is noted, quietly at first, then openly. This is where the moral fracture becomes visible to the public. When the state invests more effort in stopping a killer of criminals than in preventing crime itself, the hierarchy of concern is exposed. Castle does not need to articulate this critique. The optics do the work for him. Each failed attempt to neutralize him reinforces the perception that the system protects its own coherence before it protects lives. Heroes positioned between legality and conscience feel the strain most acutely. They are drawn into direct confrontation with Castle, not as enemies but as opposing proofs. Figures like Daredevil attempt to reassert the value of restraint through action. They intercept. They restrain. They return criminals to a system that Castle has already judged insufficient. These encounters are not framed as battles of strength. They are confrontations of logic. Each time Castle is stopped from killing someone who later reoffends, his argument sharpens. Each time a hero saves a life only for it to produce more victims, the cost of mercy becomes harder to deny. The repetition is relentless. The pattern refuses to resolve in favor of restraint. Psychologically, this repetition erodes the heroic self-image. The belief that one can remain morally pure while operating within a broken system becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Doubt creeps in, not as guilt, but as suspicion. Suspicion that restraint may function as self-preservation rather than ethical superiority. that mercy may protect the self-image of the hero more than the lives of others. Castle exploits this erosion without direct engagement. He does not taunt. He does not persuade. He allows outcomes to speak. His silence is strategic. It forces others to fill the gap with justification. And justification, repeated often enough, begins to sound like defense. The system responds by narrowing its language. Context is removed. Complexity is flattened. Castle is labeled irredeemable. Dialogue is declared impossible. This absolves the system of having to address the substance of his critique. If he is beyond reason, then his arguments do not require refutation, only containment. Yet containment proves difficult. Castle does not rely on networks that can be dismantled. He does not inspire loyalty that can be betrayed. He operates as a solitary force, adaptable and unanchored. Each attempt to corner him results in collateral exposure. Corrupt officials, complicit financiers, silent enablers. The deeper the system digs, the more it reveals what it was hiding. Public perception fractures along familiar lines. Some see Castle as a necessary evil, others as an unforgivable one. But increasingly, the debate shifts away from his actions and toward the system's failures. Castle becomes less important as a figure and more important as a lens. Through him, the public examines the gap between moral rhetoric and lived reality. This is where polarization becomes irreversible. There is no longer a shared moral language through which the conflict can be mediated. One side speaks in terms of principle and legitimacy. The other speaks in terms of outcome and survival. Each side hears the other as evasion. Castle's own psychology hardens in response, not because he doubts himself, but because doubt has become irrelevant. The environment no longer challenges his premise. It confirms it. Each failed reform, each compromised prosecution, each protected offender functions as reinforcement. The system does not correct itself under pressure. It adapts to preserve its form. This realization marks a turning point. Castle's actions grow less reactive and more anticipatory. He stops responding to crimes and begins preventing structures. His targets shift upward, not just perpetrators, but facilitators. Not just violence, but the conditions that allow it to repeat. This expansion alarms even those sympathetic to his aims. The fear is no longer about his brutality, but about his scope. If justice is absolute and mercy is obsolete, then no layer of the system is immune. The boundary between criminal and institution begins to blur. The state interprets this shift as escalation. Castle interprets it as completion. From his perspective, eliminating symptoms without addressing infrastructure is cosmetic. Justice that stops short of its sources is performative. As both sides entrench, the possibility of reintegration disappears. Castle cannot return to the system without invalidating his logic. The system cannot absorb Castle without admitting its inadequacy. They now exist as mutually exclusive architectures. The conflict has moved beyond the question of whether Castle should be stopped. It has become a question of what kind of justice can survive contact with reality. One that prioritizes legitimacy, or one that prioritizes finality. There is no neutral ground left. What follows will not be negotiation or reform. It will be consequence. The final movement does not arrive with explosion or revelation. It arrives with narrowing. Options disappear. Positions harden. What once felt like debate collapses into geometry. Two structures occupy the same territory, and neither can yield without ceasing to exist. The conflict becomes less visible in language and more visible in consequence. Castle's presence now alters behavior before action occurs. Criminal networks fragment preemptively. Alliances dissolve under suspicion. Recruitment slows. Violence becomes cautious rather than expressive. This is not reform. It is contraction. The ecosystem begins to shrink, not because morality has improved, but because risk has become intolerable. Castle's logic has reshaped the cost calculus. This effect extends beyond the underworld. Institutions begin to adjust quietly. Prosecutors become less flexible in certain districts. Judges issue harsher sentences while publicly reaffirming restraint. Law enforcement adopts more aggressive tactics under the cover of procedure. Castle's absolutism leaks into the system he opposes, even as it denies him. Mercy is not abandoned, but it is rationed. This leakage is critical. It reveals that Castle is not an external enemy, but a pressure source. The system absorbs what it can while rejecting the rest. In doing so, it exposes its elasticity. Principles bend when survival demands it. The moral high ground shifts subtly, without announcement. Heroes who once opposed Castle unequivocally now face internal fracture. Their public stance remains firm, but their private calculus changes. They intervene selectively. They hesitate differently. Some criminals are stopped rather than saved. Others are saved without urgency. The line between action and omission blurs. Castle does not need allies. He produces echoes. These echoes are unsettling because they undermine the narrative of clear opposition. If Castle is wrong, then his influence should corrupt absolutely. Instead, it refines. It forces adaptation. The system becomes harsher not out of cruelty, but out of fear of irrelevance. Justice that fails to deliver outcomes loses authority. Castle has demonstrated this too clearly to ignore. Psychologically, Castle himself becomes increasingly abstract. He is less a man than a function. His identity dissolves into repetition. Each mission reinforces the same structure. Identify threat. Remove threat. Withdraw. There is no escalation of emotion. No descent into chaos. This consistency denies observers the comfort of labeling him unstable. He does not unravel. He persists. This persistence reframes the moral accusation leveled against him. The problem is no longer that he kills, but that he cannot be stopped without contradiction. To stop him, the system must deploy extraordinary force. Surveillance, lethal authority, suspension of norms. In doing so, it mirrors the very logic it condemns. Mercy recedes quietly as necessity advances. The confrontation reaches a point where capture is possible, but costly. Collateral damage, public unrest, institutional exposure. The system hesitates. This hesitation is visible. Castle interprets it as confirmation. If mercy truly defined justice, hesitation would not exist. Action would be decisive. The delay proves that legitimacy remains conditional. At this stage, Castle's targets include symbols. Not for spectacle, but for pressure. Financial conduits, protected intermediaries, figures whose immunity depends entirely on procedural complexity. Their removal sends a message that resonates beyond crime. No position is safe if consequence becomes absolute. Public response intensifies. Support and opposition crystallize into identity. To endorse Castle is to reject the system's patience. To reject Castle is to defend its delays. The debate ceases to be about him. It becomes a referendum on whether justice should prioritize moral appearance or material outcome. Media narratives fracture accordingly. Some frame Castle as the embodiment of decay, others as the correction long denied. Both miss the deeper function. Castle is not a solution. He is a demonstration. He reveals what justice looks like when stripped of its symbolic cushioning. The system responds by tightening its borders. Laws are revised, authority consolidated, oversight reduced under the banner of safety. These changes are justified as defenses against extremism, yet they echo Castle's premise that effectiveness requires concentration of force, that mercy must yield when order is threatened. This convergence is the paradox at the heart of the conflict. Castle and the system begin to resemble each other structurally, even as they remain opposed narratively. Both prioritize outcome over discourse. Both accept collateral cost. Both justify action through necessity. The difference lies only in acknowledgement. Castle acknowledges the cost openly. The system obscures it through language. As this realization spreads, the conflict loses its theatrical quality. There is no final showdown that resolves the question. Instead, there is absorption. Castle's logic embeds itself into the environment. Not fully, not cleanly, but irreversibly. The movement ends not with his victory or defeat, but with displacement. The center of justice shifts. Mercy remains, but it is no longer unquestioned. It must now justify itself against consequence. It must explain its cost. The conflict has completed its structural arc. What remains is not resolution, but residue. A changed moral landscape. A system that cannot return to innocence. The question is no longer whether absolute justice requires the end of mercy. The question is how much mercy can survive once that requirement has been made visible. When the conflict reaches this stage, it no longer belongs to Castle, nor to the institutions that oppose him. It migrates outward into the collective imagination, where it acquires durability. The Punisher stops functioning as a character and begins operating as a cultural instrument. He becomes a symbolic pressure applied to shared moral assumptions, testing which of them fracture under sustained force. Popular culture absorbs him unevenly. Some narratives flatten him into spectacle, an avatar of rage stripped of context. Others elevate him into a crude fantasy of control. Both miss the deeper mechanism at work. Castle resonates not because he indulges violence, but because he refuses ambiguity at a moment when ambiguity feels like evasion. He speaks to a cultural fatigue with endless qualification, endless process, endless postponement of consequence. This fatigue does not originate in crime fiction. It emerges from lived experience, bureaucratic delay, institutional insulation, repeated exposure to harm without closure. In this environment, mercy begins to feel abstract. It becomes something spoken by those far from its cost. The Punisher enters this space as a counter-myth, a figure who collapses distance between harm and response. The symbolic power of Castle lies in how he redistributes moral weight. In traditional frameworks, the burden of restraint is placed on those capable of force. Power proves its virtue by holding back. Castle inverts this logic. He places the burden on those who would allow harm to continue. Restraint becomes suspect. Mercy becomes something that must answer for its consequences. This inversion unsettles because it exposes a hidden hierarchy. In many systems, mercy flows downward, but its costs flow outward. The forgiven offender receives relief. The institution receives moral credit. The future victim receives risk. Castle refuses this redistribution. He internalizes the cost by making himself the site of condemnation. He absorbs the moral stain that institutions disperse. This absorption is what gives his symbol its density. The skull is not merely intimidation. It is an emblem of displaced guilt. It announces that someone has chosen to carry what others avoid. This is why the symbol spreads beyond its narrative context. It becomes portable. Law enforcement adopts it quietly. Civilians display it ambiguously. Each use reflects a different relationship to unresolved anger and unmet expectation. The discomfort surrounding this appropriation reveals the symbolic instability Castle introduces. When agents of the state wear his symbol, the contradiction becomes explicit. The system borrows the effect of absolute justice while rejecting its logic. It wants the authority without the admission. This borrowing exposes the thin membrane separating sanctioned force from forbidden force. Culturally, Castle forces a confrontation with the myth of moral progress. The belief that systems naturally refine themselves through restraint is deeply embedded. Castle interrupts this narrative. He suggests that without decisive rupture, systems tend towards self-preservation rather than justice. That cruelty is not eliminated by delay, only redistributed. This suggestion resonates most strongly in moments of polarization. When societies divide into camps that no longer trust shared institutions, figures like Castle gain traction. He does not offer unity. He offers certainty. And certainty, even brutal certainty, becomes attractive when consensus feels impossible. Importantly, Castle does not function as a revolutionary symbol. He does not promise a new order. He promises removal. This distinguishes him from utopian violence. He is not building a future. He is clearing a present. This limitation makes him psychologically safer to engage with. He does not demand belief. He demands recognition. The cultural debate around him often fixates on legality. This focus is revealing. Law becomes the last refuge when moral language fails. To declare Castle illegal is easier than to address why legality feels insufficient. The insistence on procedure becomes defensive. It protects the idea that justice must look a certain way to remain justice. Yet Castle's endurance in the cultural landscape suggests that appearance is no longer enough. Audiences return to him not because they endorse his methods wholesale, but because he articulates a question that refuses erasure. What happens when mercy becomes indistinguishable from tolerance of harm? This question destabilizes identity. Those who see themselves as compassionate must confront the possibility that compassion, unmoored from consequence, becomes performative. Those who see themselves as just must confront the possibility that justice, untempered by mercy, becomes annihilating. Castle sits precisely at this fault line. Media environments amplify this tension. In an age of constant exposure, violence loses its shock value, but retains its emotional charge. Castle's appeal is not visual. It is structural. He provides narrative closure in a culture overwhelmed by open loops. Each of his actions completes a story the system leaves unfinished. This completion has symbolic cost. It narrows moral imagination. It reduces space for transformation. Critics are right to fear this. Absolute justice leaves no room for growth. But the persistence of Castle suggests that many perceive growth as a privilege reserved for those already protected. The cultural function of Castle is not to be emulated, but to be endured. He operates as a stress test. How much mercy can a culture afford before it collapses under deferred harm? How much finality can it tolerate before it becomes indistinguishable from tyranny? These questions do not resolve. They circulate. They attach to new crises, new figures, new narratives. Castle remains relevant because the conditions that produce him persist. Institutional failure, moral fatigue, asymmetrical cost. In this sense, the Punisher is not a deviation from cultural values. He is their shadow articulation. He says aloud what systems imply silently, that some lives are weighed against others, that some harms are tolerated for stability, that peace is often purchased with invisible sacrifice. By giving this logic a face, Castle forces recognition. Recognition does not equal endorsement, but it disrupts denial, and disruption is his true cultural legacy. He leaves behind not agreement, but fracture, a visible crack in the moral architecture, a reminder that justice, when stretched too far from consequence, invites its opposite to step in and restore balance by force. The conflict has fully escaped its fictional boundaries. What remains is its residue within the collective psyche, a discomfort that cannot be resolved by condemning the character who revealed it. In the aftermath, there is no silence, only recalibration. The system continues, but it no longer moves with the same confidence. Something essential has been exposed, and exposure alters function even when nothing is formally acknowledged. The Punisher does not need to remain active to persist. His logic has already embedded itself into the environment, altering how justice is imagined, justified, and defended. Castle's legacy is not measured in bodies or dismantled networks. It is measured in hesitation, in the pause that now follows every invocation of mercy, in the unspoken awareness that restraint carries consequence, and that consequence may return multiplied. Justice can no longer present itself as inherently benevolent. It must now explain itself. This explanation is rarely offered directly. Instead, institutions respond by tightening language, refining procedure, narrowing discretion. Mercy becomes conditional, monitored, justified through risk assessment rather than moral instinct. Compassion survives, but it is framed defensively, as something that must prove it will not betray those who grant it. In this sense, Castle succeeds without victory. He forces justice to become self-conscious. The myth of automatic moral superiority collapses. Authority must now account for outcome, not intention. The system learns to speak more carefully, not because it has grown wiser, but because it has been challenged by a logic it cannot fully dismiss. Psychologically, Castle becomes static. He does not evolve. This is often interpreted as limitation, but it is central to his function. He is not meant to grow. Growth implies negotiation with the future. Castle is anchored to an event that closed time for him. His family's death fixed his orientation permanently. He does not move forward. He enforces backward. This fixation grants him symbolic clarity. He cannot be redeemed because redemption would dissolve his premise. He cannot be rehabilitated because rehabilitation presumes a system capable of repair. Castle stands as evidence of what emerges when repair is perceived as illusion. The discomfort he generates persists because it cannot be resolved through narrative closure. Killing him would not restore innocence. Absorbing him would collapse legitimacy. Ignoring him would deny the cost he has made visible. Each option fails. The system is left carrying the tension he introduced. Culturally, this tension expresses itself through repetition. Castle returns in new forms, new eras, new crises. Each iteration reframes the same question under different conditions. The details shift. The core remains. How much harm can be tolerated in the name of restraint? How much restraint can be maintained in the face of recurring harm? The endurance of this question signals its function as myth. Myths do not solve problems. They hold them in place. They preserve contradiction so that it can be revisited when conditions demand. The Punisher occupies this role precisely. He is not a guide. He is a boundary. That boundary marks the point where mercy ceases to feel virtuous and begins to feel complicit, where justice stops being aspirational and becomes operational, where moral language breaks under the weight of repeated failure. Importantly, Castle does not claim moral authority. He claims necessity. This distinction prevents easy dismissal. Authority can be challenged. Necessity must be disproven. and the system struggles to do so convincingly. Each failure reinforces the suspicion that Castle addressed something real. Yet his presence also marks a warning. Absolute justice, once normalized, cannot distinguish itself from domination. The clarity it provides comes at the cost of imagination. There is no room for transformation where finality reigns. This cost is not abstract. It is embedded in Castle himself, a man emptied of future, reduced to function. The legacy, then, is double. Castle exposes the cost of mercy and embodies the cost of its removal. He stands between two failures, neither of which can be embraced without loss. The system cannot fully reject him without denying its own inadequacy. It cannot fully accept him without becoming what it claims to oppose. This unresolved position is where he remains, not as solution, not as villain, as residue, a trace left behind by a system pushed past its capacity for delay. In the end, the Punisher does not answer whether absolute justice requires the end of mercy. He proves that once the question is honestly asked, neither mercy nor justice can return to their original forms. The conflict does not end. It hardens, and in that hardening, it becomes permanent.